it makes sense to try to use strict form as often as possible in your exercises. Hey, everybody. Thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. And when I make this statement, this is something I've started saying more and more in the last year. As I've gained more experience as a coach, more experience as a lifter, over 25 years in the game. And I want to be clear, this is not a position that I held 5 years ago or 10 years ago when I was putting out content. So when I make this discussion, this is not just saying, hey, there's been a kind of a change in stance here and a change in maturity on my part, my approach to training and the information I put out. It's saying, I didn't have it fully right before. And there are times when we have to step up and say, look, maybe I wasn't right. Maybe as I've gained more information and more maturity, I've come to realize that there were flaws in my previous position. And so we then have an obligation to adjust those positions for the people who follow us. And I think that is the ethical and mature approach to take with this sort of thing. Now, I have previously said, look, there's a case to be made for controlled cheating. Okay, what was my general argument? Heavier eccentric overloads, right? Because if we cheat on a weight a little bit, have to use a little bit of body English, a cheat curl, a cheat row, a push press, whatever it is we happen to be doing. All right, we're lifting a heavier weight than we can really lift with the muscles we want to target on the concentric, the way up, but then on the way down, we're getting an eccentric overload. Okay, we're getting an eccentric overload. Okay, and I can remember everyone always says eccentric reps are really important for gaining muscle. And again, there's something to be said for eccentric reps for things like stretch-mediated hypertrophy to some extent. So all of that being said, does it really make a lot of sense to do that? Right? Does it really make a lot of sense in the grand scheme of things? And I'm going to say no. And here's why. Because at the end of the day, it's all still about putting tension on the muscle. And the concentric is just as important. No one's ever going to convince me that the eccentric is more important. Can eccentric loading itself produce slightly different types of hypertrophy and hypertrophy stimulus? You bet. So is it probably important, if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy, we obviously should have a concentric and an eccentric rep. Okay? If our goal is to maximize hypertrophy, that's muscle tissue growth, right? Growth stimulus in the actual contractile proteins of the muscle. All right. So I don't want to discount eccentrics either, but I also don't want people to stand there and say, well, eccentric is more important than the concentric. I don't know that the evidence has ever confirmed that. Is it important? Yes, but so is the concentric. Now, that being said, muscle fibers are stimulated by putting tension on them. It's by putting tension on, not just on the muscle, but on the individual fiber. In other words, for a muscle fiber to grow, and there's thousands or millions of them just in your biceps alone. For a muscle fiber to grow, it has to contract. It has to be stimulated. Now, there's an argument for things like stretch-mediated hypertrophy. I understand that. We're going with the conventional data that we have. Because keep in mind that also with things like sarcomere links actually has very limited short-lived growth. It's not something you can keep doing indefinitely if we go off the data. But contracting muscle fibers, getting them to fully contract and then fatigue, that does seem to work indefinitely. Okay? That is something you can continue to do for years, decades even, and continue to see muscle gains even if they're going to be diminished. So that really is kind of the point. We need to be contracting the muscle fibers that we want to grow. So not just the muscle, but here's the thing to look at something like a cheat curl. All right, here's the way we would look at a cheat curl. If we want the biceps to grow, the individual fibers in the bicep, we should probably be using the bicep to do the exercise. Pretty straightforward. Are we still using it if we cheat on the concentric? Sure. But how much? In other words, are we failing eccentrically when we reach failure? Because if we're having to cheat, we may not be getting an optimal concentric load. We could argue, yes, the bicep is doing part of it, but we don't know how much. I mean, realistically, and you're probably seeing failure on the eccentrics. That's where the muscle failure is happening. Now, if you're going to argue that the eccentric is better, then it makes sense, but I don't know that the evidence is really there for that. So it almost feels like if you're going to do cheat exercises, you're shortchanging the concentric rep to get a stronger eccentric. I want to go out on a limb and say I don't know that that's the best way to gain muscle. I actually at this point in time do not believe that it is. I'm not saying you can't cheat a little every now and then on it, by the way. I'm simply saying that as a general rule for most of your training, it should try to be reasonably strict. It doesn't have to necessarily be slow, but it should be reasonably strict. And in so doing, we are generally going to ensure that we reach concentric muscle failure. Okay? Because that's usually what we're trying to do. Because if you're getting real close to concentric failure, you can slow the last eccentric down a lot on a last rep. If you know, man, I know I can't do another rep after this one. I know I'm not going to be able to. If you just lower that eccentric slower than normal, that'll reach eccentric failure, and then you won't be able to do the concentric failure at all. Okay, so we're going to be able to do it that way, and that's done better with control. All right, the other thing, if we are doing cheat reps, we also are going to have a higher risk of injury, okay? And we have to accept that. We have to accept that. If we're going to cheat on exercise, you're going to do a cheat curl. You're going to do a really heavy cheat lateral. I don't ever see people get hurt on a cheat lateral. We've all seen people get hurt on a cheat curl. We've seen people hurt their backs on cheat rows. I used to be big on cheat rows. I think I have an even better back now that I focus on stricter rowing and pull-ups. I feel like my lats are probably bigger. Now, that's not evidence, of course, because my lats are probably going to get bigger as many years as I continue to train them hard. I've been training longer. Okay, fair enough. But in that case, I feel like they're better. I feel like my biceps are better now that I've gone stricter. But here's the other thing. My tendons don't always hurt as much. I feel better. And this is kind of a big deal. All those cheat reps beat you up. They're harder on recovery. They beat your tendons up. Okay? You go do heavy cheat curls. You guys saw me doing right there, just 75-pound strict curls. I used to do cheat curls with 185 pounds with probably a little bit smaller biceps than I have now. You know what? I used to sometimes feel at my elbows and tendons more. Is that then increasing the risk of injury? Yes. Those tendons get inflamed. You're going to reach overuse. Because what causes us to get hurt? Overuse. Overuse is the number one cause of injuries in the weight room, at least if we go off the research and data we have. Not saying it's fully conclusive. It definitely biases in that direction. Overuse. Well, if we're cheating more and those tendons are getting more inflamed, they're having to handle much heavier weights than they would normally be able to do for a strict rep, we're increasing our risk of overuse. We're increasing our risk of getting hurt. It's just safer, and you're probably going to get slightly better gains from just training strict.